Today, I'm going to walk you through my process on how I made this desk built from solid walnut. This is also going to be my submission into the Rockler Desk Challenge that's being hosted by the Modern Maker podcast and Rockler. My first step was to work on the base for the desk. It was going to take the longest and had the most technical parts to it. I laid out a piece of 1/4 inch plywood to draw up some templates. This plywood represents the total height and width that I want the base to be. The front leg is leaned back at an angle of 8 degrees. I set this with a bevel guide on my miter saw and then transferred that angle to the plywood. The back leg is perpendicular to the ground, so that one is a lot easier to draw out. My legs are 2 inches thick, and so are the stretcher pieces that connect the front and back legs together. Once everything was drawn out, like any good Canadian woodworker, I have a trusty roll of sock tape handy to give me the radius that I wanted on each joint. Adding that radius really helps the transition from the front leg and the back leg to the stretcher pieces. That makes it look a lot less boxy. Once I was happy with the way the templates looked, I needed to cut them out. To do this, I used a combination of track saw, table saw, and bandsaw. Even though the front leg is angled back, I made sure to cut the joints at 90 degrees from the bottom of the leg. This makes everything a lot easier when it comes to gluing up. On the bandsaw, I get close to my line but leave a little bit of material that I can come back and clean up with the oscillating sander. Using the oscillating sander to come to my line, make sure that when I go to template route later, the bearing has a nice smooth surface to ride against, leaving a nice edge on the walnut. After the templates are cleaned up, I lay them out on the walnut and cut it to rough size on the miter saw. There was a little bit more waste in this than I was hoping for, but work with what you got. Now that I had all of my walnut cut to rough length, I began a long morning of milling. I took all of my pieces for the legs, the stretchers, tabletop, and drawer box to the jointer to start. Getting a nice flat face and a perpendicular edge is critical in successful panel glue-ups. Once I had that flat face and 90-degree edge, I went and planed all of the wood down to its final thickness. The legs and stretchers are 1 1/4 inches thick, and the desktop has a final thickness of 1 1/8. The final step of the milling process was to take all of my pieces to the table saw and cut them to width. Again, the stretchers are cut at 2 inches wide, and the tabletop will have a final dimension of 23.5 inches. Finally, after all of my pieces are completely milled, I take the templates that I have finished and put them on the walnut to trace them out. I use a Sharpie for this so that when I go to the bandsaw to cut them out later, if I barely touch the Sharpie line, it leaves the perfect amount of material to cut away with the router. I still don't have a bandsaw, so I had to jump over to my buddy Dan's shop to borrow his. Here I am cutting out each leg blank. Now that the pieces are cut out, I tape the templates back onto the walnut using some double-sided carpet tape. Then, take my router with a top-bearing flush trim bit and cut away most of the waste. The bearing runs against the template, leaving me with 2 identical front legs and 2 identical back legs. I'm careful not to cut the joint section on the router, as I will take them to the table saw later on to make it more accurate and safe cut. Here I'm going to use a technique from Chris at 4 Eyes to cut the joint faces on the table saw. I create a temporary table saw sled to line up the joint face of the template with the edge of the sled, and then tape down some stop blocks to make sure that my cuts are going to be repeatable. Then run the sled against the fence and voila, the joints are cut. Once those joints were cut, I cut the stretchers to length that will attach the front and back legs to each other. Then, added in a bunch of dominoes to keep everything perfectly aligned and nice and strong. Next, I put each side in the clamps using some angled offcuts on the outside of the front of the leg so that enough clamping pressure can be applied without the clamp slipping off. After the glue dried, I added a heavy round over before gluing the 2 sides together with the horizontal stretchers. This really adds to that mid-century modern look that I was going for. The first stretcher that will be used to attach the drawer box was being glued in right at the front of the legs, so I tilted my table saw to 8 degrees and then ripped another piece so that it could match the front angle of the legs. When those pieces were all cut, I could do the final glue up for the base. Using the dominoes in this project really made this glue up a lot less stressful than I'm sure it would be without them. I simply put the one side of the base down, added some glue, dominoes, and then did the same on the top and added the clamps. While the glue dried on the base, I switched my attention to gluing up the desktop. I had already milled all of my lumber, so I just had to add some dominoes and then clamp it all together. When the glue had dried, I used my track saw to cut it to the final length, which was 50 inches. I also wanted to give the desktop a rounded corner, so I used some templates that I had 3D printed at my school to tape to the top, and then use my router and that flush trim bit to make it happen. Alright, so the desktop is done, the base is done. I set both of those aside and started to work on the final component of the build. The drawer compartment and face and the drawer box. Again, all of the walnut was already milled, so I put the compartment components into the clamps. This is where milling properly really shows up. One clamp in the middle, twisted a couple times, and the squeeze out appears. Once that was dry, I cut one edge on the track saw, and then on the table saw, cut the pieces to the right size. To make this compartment, I cut some rabbets in on each end of the top and bottom on the table saw. I lowered the blade to cut out about 1/4 inch and made a single pass on the face. Then I turned the board on edge and cut out the rest of the waste. Off camera, I took all 4 of these pieces and glued up the box. While the glue was drying on the compartment, next I could make the drawer box. For this, I just used some 1/2-inch plywood and kept it really simple. The drawer box was 17 inches long by 5 inches tall and 10 inches wide. This gives plenty of room to store your computer mouse, some pens, some paper, etc. Before sanding and finishing, I used a Forstner bit to cut out a recess that will house some figure 8 fasteners. This will allow me to attach the tabletop to the base and still allow for wood movement. Finally, everything was ready for sanding and finishing. I used a combination of my orbital sander and hand sanding, paying close attention to the rounded sections right by the joints. For finish, I used Odie's oil that I applied liberally and then used a 5-inch sander with a Scotch-Brite pad attached to buff it all in. I let it sit for about half an hour and came back and wiped off any excess. Last step was assembly. I screwed the drawer compartment to the 2 stretchers and then used the playing card trick to install the drawer face to the drawer box. I took a bunch of playing cards and put them underneath the drawer face until it was pushed against the top of the compartment. Then, split those cards in half and place each under the drawer face. This leaves the gap at the top and the bottom the same. Clamp it in place and screw it on from inside the drawer. With that, this desk is done. I'm really pleased with the way that it turned out. I think that it will be a desk that can be passed down multiple generations. If you like the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Drop me a comment down below if you're also working from home, and tell me a little bit about what your desk situation looks like. Thanks so much for watching, and I also want to say a thanks to the guys at the Modern Maker podcast and at Rockler for putting on the Desk Challenge.